Okay. We started actually this project with Tapiwa Seremani and Pablo Fernández in 2016. And it was after we watched a reality TV show, which is called UK Border Force. And when we watched this TV show, we were left a bit we felt awkward after watching it. And especially because we thought that the way the TV show was portraying the work of immigration officer was a bit sometimes dehumanizing for the travelers that were portrayed, and yet we didn't feel that that the TV show was built to generate compassion towards those travelers that were selected out of the UK, let's say. But when we decided to work on this topic, actually we were very naive, and we wanted to just study the interactions as we saw them between the officer at the airport and the travelers they were kind of encountering, let's say. So it was a paper that was supposed to be about dehumanization within some professions, and observable through those interactions. So I said this was very naive because it was our first mistake when we started using film as a data set for organization theory kind of questions, because we totally failed to qualify the data set or the film as a specific form of material that needed to be questioned and unpacked per se. To be more precise, what we wanted to do, so I took the allegory of this picture here, we wanted to really focus on observable interaction that were happening within the screen, let's say, and try to unpack them as we would have unpacked interactions that we would have observed, let's say. And doing so, we totally neglected all the layers of mediation that were existing, meaning, for instance, the different camera angles, camera editions, so the eye of the film producer somehow, and also our own perspective on the material, our own subjectivity. Linked to this mistake, there was also a taking for grantedness of this type of material as being interesting for organization studies. And it was not really, I mean, it's not always the case. A lot of people just found it awkward and too alien for the field. Linked to this as well, we were not totally engaged with the pop culture literature. We were taking that as a kind of contextual, empirical context instead of really deeply addressing this question. So when we tried to submit the paper first, it was to organization studies, and we got a desk reject. And for instance, the editor told us that she thought that this data source, TV episodes, would be problematic for the reviewers and for the journal, because the data was compiled by the show's producers, and we needed to explain why the recordings provided us with appropriate data that would be suitable for analysis. So this, it was something that was totally new for us, trying to understand, okay, how this specific data is constructed and how this construction will impact what we can understand from what we see in the movies. And then we sent that to Journal of Business Ethics, and we got similar, even if we had transformed the paper in between, we got similar comments that we were not totally fully committed to build a research question that was really in line with the material that we had at hand. This is why I said we had only a partial engagement in pop culture literature, whilst actually, well, my advice, if you want to really use this type of material, is that you really need to formulate a research question that consider what you can actually access with this type of material. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to address those problems. First, the problem of why this type of material can be interesting to organization theory, and how to justify it somehow, and also what are the different methods that we could actually apply to try to make sense of the different layers of mediation that exist when we are using this type of material that is not made by the researchers. So first, here, what I mean when I say film, I'm going to use the word of film all the time in order to simplify the discourse, let's say. So it's any kind of edited series of pictures giving the impression of movement, so audiovisual material, which is meant for a wide diffusion. So I can talk about, pop culture movies. It could be cartoons as well, documentary film, reality TV show, other audiovisual support. Like, for instance, it could be an edited video produced by an organization to talk about their CSR strategy or whatever. But what I exclude is anything that is produced by the researcher teams, for instance. So I'm not talking about videography. I'm not talking about social science movies or these kind of things. I also exclude non-edited recording of meetings, daily operations, or surveillance videos and things like this. So it's really about something that has been intentionally somehow edited with this idea of wide diffusion. So somehow there's a message behind the movie that is at least partially intentional. So why this is different for organization studies? The first answer that is the most common one, or the one that has been more largely addressed, and especially by the cultural studies in organizations, is because they have a political influence on society. By political, I mean that they really participate in delineating what is made visible or not, and in articulating how different social phenomenon can be articulated somehow. I put the books of Blaker here because I think he's not talking only about films, but about visuals in general, but he makes a very interesting point about how all those visuals have a kind of political meaningness, let's say, in society. And in the field of organization studies, I think that one of the classic books to introduce you to pop culture in management is really the one by Emma Bell, who was written in 2008, Reading Management and Organization in Films. And here you also have the same idea that pop culture film really can shape and influence collective perceptions of organizations and work, and especially because they are targeted to a large audience, and they provide us with interpretative templates of how we are supposed to behave in organizations, for instance. Or, I mean, it gives a lot of it provides a lot of stereotypes as well, but also expectations that are sometimes, I mean, several authors argue that they are more influential than managerial textbooks. And most of the time, our first encounter with the world of organizations is through pop culture movies, for instance. So to dig a bit deeper in this idea of pop culture films being like having a political kind of impact, in society, it can happen at 3 different levels, or it can be translated in 3 different ways, rather. Sometimes they just construct and reinforce some moral narratives and structures that exist, power structures or stereotypes. Sometimes, on the contrary, they can question some organizational practices, and in some cases, they are even intended to bring about social change. Generally, this is true for documentaries, and I put you some references here that are interesting for any of those directions. So they are not neutral, basically. They allow us to step back and reflect on our day-to-day practices. The second reason why it can be relevant for organization studies to look at films is because they are increasingly becoming strategic tools for organizations. So up to now, we have talked more about, movies that can portray organizations or organizational life, but without direct ties with specific organizations. But we observe that there are more and more a blurriness between, the lines between the organizations that are portrayed and the film industry are more and more confusing. They can have some partnerships that are unclear, actually. So you have a lot of TV show that appears generally is reality TV show, like Selling Sunset, for instance, in which a particular organization is portrayed. And this raises new questions about what will be the impact of those portrayals in the specific industries, and what are the benefits for the organizations as well to accept to be visible like this or portrayed in a pop culture way for entertainment. And for instance, you have some research about that, but it's not like it's not the dominant approach. But for instance, IÉSEG in 2019 has analyzed the TV show that was made by the BBC and that was portraying the BBC at a moment where they were facing a lot of challenges. And IÉSEG shows that this TV show helped them to repair some relationships with stakeholders. In a similar way, you can see also the paper of Shao and Janssens, which have analyzed highly edited CSR videos, which also offers specific view of the organizations. And in this sense, is really about self-representation, which opens a new area of research about how, like organizations communicate and which type of emotions and narratives do they provide about themselves through those supports. One question that was really important to us with me and my co-author when we tackled the project of studying the TV show UK Border Force was the emotional aspects of it all. Because actually, research has shown that if TV shows and film are really pervasive, it's because they really evoke emotions and they draw attention to the embodied nature of organizational life. Because we approach them as well through our sensory way of knowing, meaning that, for us, it was something very troubling, or we didn't know how to make sense of this, because we were first seeing the emotions that were displayed in the character inside the movie. And we were also feeling some emotions, sometimes the same, sometimes different emotions, and the emotions that we were feeling, it was in reaction to those images, but also filtered by our own, positionality, let's say. So we were like, clearly, there's something emotional going on around those movies, but at different levels of mediation. But we didn't know exactly how to analyze those different layers of emotions. And there was no, at the beginning of the study, it was really the starting point of the burgeoning of, multimodal studies in organizational theory. So there was not a lot of resources for us to know how to make sense of those emotional registers. So we had to look for answers in different streams of the literature to try to unpack what was happening with the TV show. So the analytical complexity that we faced was of, let's say, 3 different dimensions or realms. First, we didn't know how to select what to analyze. It's a classic problems when we want to study videos in general and films in particular. Because first, there's a lot of data. Like sometimes you have, the movies themselves, they are long, and sometimes you have series of movies that you want to consider. So at the end, it's a lot. And also, because they are multimodal, you don't know if you should listen only to what people say, if you want to look at the gestures that they are portraying, or if you want to listen to the music that is accompanying the movie. So you don't know which kind of modality you have to focus on. You also have a problem in defining what will be the correct unit of analysis, okay? How to actually select the scenes that matters, let's say, or is it about a shot, is it about a scene, a sequence, etc. So you have, I'm going to explain later on where you can have answers or directions that can guide you in selecting the appropriate unit of analysis, but it's one difficulty. The second one was how to account for the editing choices made in the absence of the researchers. So the editing choices of the film producers, which is something that the reviewers were really willing for us to explain. And for this question, I think that multimodal studies are the most adapted. I find, because they are really trying to focus on what is in the movie, what is the filmic construction that you have in front of you. And then the third one was, for us, the most problematic, which was how to approach the emotional dimensions of films and how to account for our own subjectivity in approaching films. So in what follows, we are going to look at different methods, and you'll have partial answers to those questions. So the first wave of method that was dominant in organization theory, trying to analyze film, what we call reading films. So here, films are considered like as a series of texts that can be read like books somehow. So it's a holistic approach where you consider a movie like the unit of analysis is really the full movie somehow. And then you can see that the interpretation of filmmakers, they are embedded within those texts or those movies somehow. It's the idea that, that Meyer and Al will call, sedimented knowledge that exists in archaeological data that reveals as well a specific socio-political context somehow. And then the meaning of the text is permeated with the viewer's cultural experiences. So what is interesting here is that they recognize the subjectivity of the interpreter. And the idea is not to reveal the true meaning behind the movie, but rather to offer an interpretation by looking at interpreting the signifiers and contradictions within the data, or between the data and some sets of theory, for instance. So this is a very interesting approach, and you have a lot of references that follow this. The only problem is that sometimes it's not really the methods, the methodological steps that those authors have been through to analyze the movie are not always explicit. So it was very difficult to understand how the analyses were actually made. And in terms of recognizing the subjectivity of the interpreter, it was not necessarily also visible in the method. So it was a first step, but that's for what we wanted to do didn't totally help. Here I provided with 2 examples of reading in films where I think that the method is a bit more explicit, so it's quite interesting. The first one is a study by Bezanel and Dambo, which tried to see how the movie Mad Men portrays mentoring processes, and with a focus on power structures and gendered and social relations. So here, for instance, what is good with the reading films is that you can have a large data set because the granularity of the analysis is lower. It's not really precise, let's say. So there's a large data set that has been investigated, and the technique was to take notes in an explorative way and then to identify through those note-taking critical incidents, and then to rewatch several times those critical sequences in order to analyze a bit further what type of portrayal they were diffusing, and contrasting that with different sequences, different movies, or it could be an evolution towards time, etc. And for Bon Corey, with her analysis of Mission Impossible, different movies of the series, it was a similar kind of endeavor. Then you have film content analysis. There's not a lot of examples of film content analysis, and it's quite surprising because in terms of visual studies, you find, I mean, when you take visual studies more largely, you find much more content analysis happening there, with, for instance, analyzing the different images that are found in company reports, etc. And the idea here is to systematically count and compare some representation that appear in audiovisual communication. So it can be about, for instance, given type of colors, or specific spaces arrangements, things like this. And I took the examples here of a study by McDonald, who tried to investigate how is adult paid work portrayed in family features lens film. So she looked at 42 movies, and she listed first all the type of occupation and workers, genders that were shown in those different movies. And then it was about counting the number of appearance of a character, noting also their gender. After that, it was this was somehow a quantitative part of the study, and then a more qualitative part emerged by the identification of themes and recurring patterns of representation, and checking for disconfirming evidence, etc. And finally, you have multimodal analysis. So again, as I was saying at the time, it was quite new, and it became prominent actually in video analysis, that is for videos that are made by the research team. But for video analysis of films that are edited, it remains very limited in our field. So multimodal analysis is basically the recognition that communication encompasses multiple semiotic modes of knowledge. It can be like the verbal mode, the tone, it can be the visual modes, olfactory modes, etc. And each mode have specific affordances, and they have a specific, they offer a specific meaning, somehow, invitation. And what is important for multimodal analysis is that complete messages are thought to be, we can understand them only when we consider all the modalities together and not each modality separately. Yeah, and yeah, generally what they say is that, and I agree with this, is that every the analytical protocol that you will use in multimodal analysis needs to depend on your research question and on the empirical setting that you have. So I took back the example of Shao and Janssens, which is a paper that I like a lot, and I think that is very clear in terms of what they have done with the data. So it was a set of CSR video by different multinational organizations, and they have developed a coding structure where they considered 8 verbal and 9 visual dimensions of communication, and then once they had this analytical framework, they were able to code what was happening in each movie along those different modalities. And then, of course, compare what was happening within and across the cases. Here on our side, well, this study of Shao and Janssens was published in 2022, so we didn't have access to that at the time where we were struggling with how to analyze our TV show. So we went to multimodality in film studies as well. And also we were a lot inspired by Toraldo and Al's studies of multimodality in videos that were made by the research team. So in film studies, there's a book that is very explicit but very, very complex by Batman and Schmidt, published in 2013. What I found interesting in this book is that they are really making a good claim that films are constructed in the way that guides viewer interpretation. Because with the reading films in management, we always had, like some reviewers' feedback criticizing the method for saying that it's too, how can we check that our interpretation is at least partially correct somehow? It's like there's a lot of criticism regarding this. And with these film studies, you really have a case to make that actually, if we don't agree on the fact that that films have the capacity to at least invite some lines of interpretation, then we wouldn't be able to understand anything of a movie. There's a basis at which can be a cultural basis that allows us to understand somehow what a film means. And they are then very explicit in showing how the filmic construction can actually guide interpretation. And they say as well that when the interpretation is left open, this is also sometimes intentional. It's the movie makers that intentionally wants us to have a discussion maybe after we watch the movie with our different interpretations, etc. So here the focus is really on what is in the movie prior to any form of interpretation. How is it constructed purely, shots after shots or whatever? For instance, they give an example of the movie Lady from Shanghai, sorry. And in this movie, you have a scene where we see a woman pressing a button in her house. And those shots are constantly alternated with the shots where we see two men in a car. And at some point she's pressing the button and we can see just after she pressed the button, a crash happening with the car. So here what they say is that the interpretation of the viewer is really guided into thinking that there's some form of a link between the action of the lady and what happens to the car. Although in a kind of logical way, we cannot see what will be the cause and consequences here. It's kind of blurry, but this blurriness is kind of made on purpose and will mean something only if we consider the movie as a whole, at the end. So this also highlights the fact that it's quite difficult to understand a movie by selecting just few cues, like a specific shot or an alternation of shots to infer the meaning of the entire movie, but you need to really understand the different sequences and how it speaks to a message that covers the entire movie. From these film studies, we also had a partial answer into how to make sense of the emotional registers that are present in the movie. So you have, for instance, Feng and O'Halloran, 2013, that has shown how the process of filmic construction includes designing specific emotional patterns with different techniques. Like here you have an example of a technique of different shots that are shown one after the other as an eliciting condition and a reaction to the eliciting condition of the emotion. So this is really like there's a guidance as well in the emotions that we as viewer are supposed to feel while watching the movie, even though of course what we feel will depend as well on our own cultural cultural context, etc. So here, what is interesting is that it allows us, it gives us materials or tools to be able to analyze what is inside the movie, including how emotions are potentially portrayed and constructed. And yet, it doesn't tell us anything anymore about our own subjectivity and positionality towards the material at hand. And for us, because we were also deriving from a social constructionist kind of view, it was really relevant to try to understand why did we feel this way while watching the movie, and what was our positionality towards this movie, because we were really believing that this has an impact in the way we understood it and in a way we interpreted it as well. So in order to address that, we had to go to reflexive approaches to video analysis. And here, at the time of the study, this was mainly or totally developed for video data that was produced by the research teams and not by film analysis, where, at least in our field, the question of subjectivity sometimes was raised, but never introduced in the analytical kind of protocol. And here, regarding video and reflexivity, we found different approaches. The first one is the social material reflexivity, which means that the camera itself is not neutral and is a mediator in the research processes, and it produces realities in the making. So we need to understand how, even if it's not intentional, how the decision we make in terms of the different shots, the things that we make visible or not, will impact the production of knowledge somehow. Other researchers were talking about political reflexivity, the fact that by recording some people, we can empower them, for instance, give them a voice, but we can also maintain some structure of oppression depending on how we portray the people. And the last form, we call that emotional reflexivity, but it was authors that showed that the emotions that were perceived by the viewers in the film, the viewers being the researchers as well, by the way, they can serve as entry points to, or as reflexive tools, actually, to better understand where we are situated in this relationship between the researcher, let's say, and its material. Okay, I'm not sure it's clear, but if you have questions, then don't hesitate. So here it's, well, the second mistake that we made at the beginning was failing to make clear and consistent epistemic choices regarding all that. So basically we had a form of patchwork where we wanted to integrate a bit of everything in making our analysis of the TV show. And at first, actually, we were already doing a form of multimodal studies in practice, but we were presenting that as a joyous structure because we didn't know better. And also, there was no explicit engagement in epistemic choices. How exactly does it matter? Does our subjectivity matter somehow? We didn't know how to integrate it, etc. So after different back and forth between those different streams of research, we established, we pushed a bit the method that was already there, and we proposed the method that we call the multimodal reflexive analysis of films, which is based on two key assumptions somehow. The first one is the importance of the emotions for understanding a movie, and the emotions being two-sided or mediated twice. There's the emotion that is in the movie somehow, that is elicited through a combination of emotional clues that are multimodally supported somehow. So this is what is portrayed or is the intention somehow of the movie maker of eliciting particular emotions. And also you have the emotions of the viewers that are filtered through our own sensory mode of knowing it depends on the aesthetic codes that we have institutionalized and all that. And we call that the emotional texture of the scenes. And we believe that those emotional textures need to be unpacked, because this is where you have a value-laden representation. So this is where you can somehow uncover the different moral narratives that are behind the portrayals that you see. And the second very important point is to really appreciate the fact that we have a liminal and awkward position as a researcher in front of this material, that we are at once a spectator of the material, a viewer, and an analyst. And actually, we can use that at our own advantage, and we try to translate it step by step in the process, in the analytical process, to make sure that our subjectivity is not like recognized in passing, but is integrated in the different steps of the method. So what we ended up with in terms of analytical steps, the first one was to subjectively approach and contextualize the film. So as a spectator, we believe that we chose to study a movie because of an aesthetic experience that was particular. You know, very often we are emotionally entangled with the data ourselves, and we need to ask ourselves the question, why have we chosen to study this film? What did we feel when watching this for the first time, and what were the specific scenes that retained our attention, and why? Because this will allow us to actually formulate research questions somehow. It will allow us to really understand our own positionality as well towards the material and potential biases. And at the same time, we have also this stepping back possibility as an analyst to ask other questions that are important to make sense of the film, such as which is the social cultural context in which the film was produced. What do we know, about the producers and funders of the film, etc. After that, we try to tackle the problems of selecting the analytical units that will matter for our study. And again, we start with our position as a spectator, which is, you know, what is in green here, the number one, which is what was especially intriguing, surprising, infuriating, etc. about the material that we believe require more in-depth investigation. And thanks to this, we can draft a first research question that could be, of course, improved later on. And based on this research question that is accessed also through our own subjectivity, we need to think about the analytical unit, meaning that there's not a single answer for which analytical unit will be good to use for any kind of movie analysis. It really depends on the context. So for instance, if you are willing to understand how service work is represented in classic British movies, maybe you are going to select different classic British movies, and then different scenes where we can see or hear about service work. You know, so it's kind of easy, it's straightforward, but it needs to be really clearly defined when you start a study, because otherwise you'll have questions from reviewers, and you can have problems as well in analyzing simply. And once you have determined what the appropriate analytical unit is for your study, then you have to check if you think it's doable or not. Does it leave you with an amount of data that you think you can handle, or is it just too much and you need to cut down, and how do you make choices of cutting down? So what would be important is simply to justify your choices mainly. In the third step, we try to reflexively identify the modalities to focus on. So again, the first stage would be like, I'm going to take an example from the Clockwork Orange, because it's a classic movie. I haven't analyzed it, but I think that this scene is you can easily find it in YouTube, and you can have you can make your own opinion about this or something. But so in this scene, you have a group of young people who in the movie are quite violent, and they are walking calmly across the quay. I think it's the flat marina scene or something. And they are not talking, they are moving, and it's slow motion, and you can see that the colors are quite pale, and you have the narrator, which is the central character, who is talking in a very calm tone as well. And you have a music that starts off being not so loud, and it's louder and louder, and the music is a classic music that gives a kind of grandiose kind of feeling. And at some point, the narrator stops talking, the music is louder, and suddenly he turns around and beat up one of his friends, let's say, people of his crew. And when I saw this scene, to me, it was disrupting. It's disturbing, and I cannot really explain why. And the idea here in this moment of the analysis, let's say, is to try to, first you can detail and compare your feelings with other members of the team, but you also try to unpack why did you feel this way. So for this, you can dig into your own positionality. Why seeing violent scenes I'm not easy with this, it's weird for me. You can ask yourself the question. And you have to also find answers in the construction of the scene. And for me, for instance, one of the things that made me disturbed with this scene is the contrast that you have between the calm, the soft tones, the colors, etc., and the brutality of the gestures. And it's in this contrast that I found my main emotions, the explanation for my main emotions. When I do that, I'm not inferring that everybody who watched this scene will feel the same way as I do. And actually, when I looked at the YouTube comments on the scene, it was quite funny, because some people were just amazed by the beauty of the scene. So for them, it was just beautiful. Some people found that funny, they laughed so hard, etc. What is interesting, though, is that on the comments, sometimes they highlight the same multimodal elements that produce the emotion of discomfort in me. For instance, they are talking about the soundtrack a lot, the music, and the comments of Alex, the main character that was calm, etc. So what we mean when we talk about subjectivity, subjectively defining, identifying the modalities, is simply not to infer that the interpretation, the emotional interpretation of the scene will be the same for everyone, but we think that recognizing our emotions allows us to open a box that that makes some modalities salient actually about the movies. And those would be maybe the modalities that matter for our analysis. And then once you have defined them with your team, with different back and forth, you can go through the scene again and detail what happened, for instance, in the verbal mode, in the visual mode, gestures, music, it could be color. I mean, you can be more or less precise, and the granularity, I mean, it's a choice of depending on the research questions and context. And here we can see that when you look at the sequence of the scenes, this is at some point, you have the contrast that happens between something calm and something brutal. And what we encourage with our methods as well to continue integrating the subjectivity inside the multimodal analysis is when you do your coding according to along different modalities, you can already add emotional elements or qualifiers, like for instance, calm tone, soft colors, lively music. And this will allow you to understand the overall emotional texture of the scene. So here it's an example from the paper that we wrote, or the TV show that we have analyzed. So after that, once you have coded along different modes separately, you look for one unit, one set of scenes, for instance. What is the emotional texture of the scene by looking at all the modalities together and what they produce when they are taken together. And by doing that, this is how you can start to identify patterns of representations that you can sometimes represent in a kind of chronological way, according to the time of the story, for instance. And you can see, for instance, with our analysis, we saw that the character of the officer was mainly represented within a calm and self-confident kind of emotional pattern, while for the travelers, we saw much more apprehension, cynicism, tension, etc. So, which created different feelings, or which actually created different understandings of what those different characters represented somehow. If you want to represent that differently, you can have also patterns of representation that incorporate the different modalities. For instance, we can see that in our study, the traveler were very often shown as passive in different ways. In the visual effect, they were maintained at distance, etc., while the officers were much more active, in charge, and we had a lot of shots that suggested that we were taking their viewpoints, etc. And through that, and contrasting as well with the literature, etc., we saw that the characters, the different characters, were portrayed with a different type of moral narratives. Some was much more emotional and threatening, while the other was more rational and heroic. So that is all for me for the presentation. For the key takeaways, I think that you have to remember that there are multiple ways to analyze films in organization theory. And I think that you almost always have to adapt your protocol to your research question and to the film at hand. And don't hesitate to get inspired by other methods. You just need to really justify it and make sure that your research question and epistemological standpoints are matching your method, basically. And in terms of future research, I think that a lot needs to be discovered around the relationship and impacts between pop culture portrayals and the organizations that are portrayed, specifically when the portrayals are about a specific industry or organizations that exist in real life. I think it could be interesting as well to compare and contrast portrayals that exist across different supports and for different audiences. And there's also an increased use of social media and semi-edited videos by organization, and I don't know how this impacts their communication and the way they present themselves and assert values and moral narratives around themselves. So thank you very much, and I would be very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Carine. That was very interesting. So in terms of questions, I mean, I can see a couple of questions in the chat function. Ravi and Haitao posted some questions, and people made out the comments as well. Ravi and Haitao, do you want to go ahead and maybe ask a question directly to Carine? And also, if anybody else has questions, if you could raise your hand, the virtual hand, so we can see you.
Hey, Carine, nice to see you here.
Hey.
Thank you. It's very interesting. So by the way, yeah, very insightful. My question is how much generalizable you feel the analytical steps, because I feel this is a very emotional specific, right? And you use your paper process to show the analytical steps. So for example, we are doing something else. What would be, yeah. Let me just summarize generalizability. Thank you.
What? Sorry, I couldn't hear the.
So for example, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, so I mean, because the steps you presented is quite specific to research and emotion, right? The emotion trigger in such films, and you also use your paper as an example to show the process.
Yes.
So I was asking, is these steps generalizable to other research out of emotion?
Yes, yes, I think that the method is not supposed to be only about emotions, but really about portrayals in movie. And the thing is that in comparison, let's say that if you take the classic multimodal analysis, including in film studies, they will really look at what is inside the movie, so the different modalities, what we have actually in our method, because we took from that. But then they say nothing about our own subjectivity. And the problem is that as a social constructionist, if you have this epistemology, you cannot do without somehow adding this reflexive side. So we decided to add this reflexive side to paying attention to our emotions specifically. So the emotions are more, let's say, a tool to access the meanings of film. And sometimes, like when you see people being portrayed always as threatening. So threatening is an emotion, right? And this tells you something about the moral narrative that is behind this. Like if they are threatening, maybe they are bad people. I'm caricaturing a bit, but the idea is really this, and maybe it was not explicit, is not to uncover necessarily the emotions per se, but it's to use that as a tool to understand better the values that are represented behind those characters and portrayals, etc.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? So for the reflexivity part, if you were able to validate your finding with the filmmaker, from the producer, will that address part of the your interpretation concern?
It's a good question. I think it's something that I would love to try once, a method, and they exist again much more in videos that are edited or made by the researcher teams, participatory method in video studies. And I would love to be able to do that for the film industry as well. It's generally more difficult to have access to the producers, and yet the idea again is not necessarily to find a true meaning or interpretation, because the thing is that sometimes when it's the same for us as researchers. We write an article, or let's say we make a movie, and we want to say something, we have a message that is clear, and yet the public understand that very differently. So the fact that the producer will agree with me, I'm not sure it will matter. It depends on the research question,
Thank you. It's great. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from Ravi Carine. I'll just read it out to you. Films oftentimes dramatize and distort reality. So would this not create biases in the research findings?
Yes, but actually this is why it's interesting, I would say. I would say that at first, when I was explaining at the very beginning of the presentation how we approach film naively, we really looked at the movie as if it was reality somehow. especially it was a reality TV show, so it's always also a problem. I mean, the way they package that. And yes, in this sense, if you take what you see for granted, it's really problematic. And actually, all the methods that I have presented here, film content analysis, reading movies in management, multimodality, etc., they are made to actually unpack the dramatization somehow. You know, so the idea is to have a research question that is consistent with that, where you ask how are those things portrayed, okay, and not how are those things occurring somehow. And then what is interesting to note is that this dramatization actually has impact in the way we understand the organizations work, etc. Is that clear? Or?
Yeah, maybe I could just build on Ravi's question, because there's an element of the fact that, you know, the films are edited, they are purposefully created with a particular intention to convey a particular position or idea, and in many respects also exaggerate the reality, or maybe undermine it. So when we watch these films, you know, what kinds of, how do we make sure, you know, what kind of reliable insights can we generate, considering that the data given to you is in some respects fake, if you like?
Yeah. The thing is that I think that you always have to keep in mind that this is not reality, even when it's reality TV or even documentaries. And yes, yet this is the thing, is that the expectation or the intention even of movie makers would be different. Like for a documentary, for instance, they will try to give you facts, but you have to always keep in mind that there are never neutral facts somehow. So all the key of this type of studies is actually to point at this edition and how things are constructed and how they shape a certain vision of reality. So yeah, the idea is not to interpret the movie as if they were kind of real. And if your question is about how come they still shape and influence collective perceptions, I'm not sure if it was the question. I think it's that even if we watch a fiction and we are conscious that it's a fiction, when an image or a kind of pattern of representation is repeated again and again, it ticks somewhere, somehow, you know, it's still a form of kind of reference point somewhere, you know. Yet for, I mean, another method would be needed to understand how it, I mean, the impacts of or the influence of films on specific audiences. And this is not at all what I've done here or talked about here, but it's more about audiencing studies. So I don't know if it addresses the question or not.
No, I understand. No, thank you. I guess I just want to have another question, maybe building on this. So next time we're watching a film, I don't know, maybe on Netflix or on Amazon Prime. So, you know, do you have any tips on how to approach, say you're watching it for the first time, perhaps, something new, you know, based on your experience, what tips do you have that we can then, when watching a film as a social scientist, rather maybe less so for relaxation purpose?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if, I mean, I think that there could be different tips, but I think what is very, I mean, I find quite revelatory is who is visible in the film or who is given a chance to talk. And especially, I mean, it depends on given the choice to talk always matter, I would say. But in a reality TV show, for instance, or, you know, semi-reality TV, like I was talking about Selling Sunset or whatever, who occupies the space of the TV show, who is able to talk directly to the camera, meaning the audience, or not, etc. I think this is cues that are quite interesting. And I love also listening to the music. the type of tone that is proposed is often revelatory of what the movie producers want to convey in terms of a message. But then, I mean, I don't really, I mean, I guess other people will answer differently, you know. So.
Thank you, Carine. Yamini has a hand up. Yamini?
Hello, Professor. So I had a question regarding the analysis. So usually in some of the methodologies with a particular epistemology, we write down our reflections and bring out multiple perspectives to bring out multiple layers. So how did you achieve that? And secondly, how did you make sure that the various subjective positions were also portrayed when you were talking about your positionality?
Actually, well, the way we tried to integrate the multiple layers was in playing with, on one side, the multimodal analysis as it is in film, where the focus is really in what is in the movie. So who is talking, what type of shots they are using, etc. And on the other side, the subjectivity was more on, let's say, the qualifications that I added to those cues. For instance, I'm going to try to have the last examples. Here, for instance, in the visual effect, I have medium shots. I highlight some stuff that matters, like signs that are highly visible. Sometimes I will add something like somebody look upset. You know, I will qualify what I see with something that could be understood as subjective, because it's the way I understand the emotion that is portrayed, for instance, or the scene that is portrayed. Or I will say, for instance, when we see, I think it was in the other slides, sometimes we see camera shots that are behind the shoulder of the person, and this is where normally in field studies is when we take the position of the officer. So the position is explained in the method at the beginning, some reflection about why we have chosen this material and what type of reaction we have in front of the material. But to me, in the method, I try to contrast it always with using that as also a way to recognize our bias and opening up towards different interpretations. And then it's much more about, you know, the structure of what we see. Does that answer the question, or?
It does. I just had a quick question to that. So when you write down your interpretations, do you also make sure that you write down multiple of them, or you just stick with one and then like just that clarification?
So for the, let's say, how to qualify your music, for instance, is it a suspenseful music or whatever kind of qualification we'll have? If we have a research team, it's always easier because we can discuss with different, with our colleagues to see, how would you qualify that? And then we agree on a determination, basically. If we are studying this alone, we can get, yeah, I didn't say this, but depending on the modality that you want to focus on, you can really push further in terms of method. So if you really want to push in terms of music, you can look at, let's say, musicology, or, you know, like, in film analysis, you have some people who have detailed much more how to qualify properly different sounds and music. So you can help you with this kind of table somehow. Or
okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome.
Carine, there's a question in the chat from Ritis. What organizations do you have in mind when you say organization studies? Your research bring benefits to the studies? There are multiple questions here. Perhaps your research would benefit from narrowing it down. For instance, what does Clockwork Orange have to do with organizations unless they're criminal gangs? Same with the reality shows.
So for organization studies, I was simply talking about the field of organization studies in general. So I don't know, I mean, I was not having in mind one type of organization, but having a very general reflection on how it could contribute to the field of organization studies. And I think it's in two ways, as I said. The first way is that a lot of movies, cartoons, whatever, they portray organizational life. So they somehow also, I mean, if I'm taking back what has been published before, they create some interpretative templates or expectations, a norm of behavior that you will find back sometimes in the workplace. And the relationship is not direct, is not clear-cut, but it's more creating, it's part of our social cultural landscape, actually. So I think that it's interesting to dig further into what is there, what is this social cultural landscape that provide us with understandings of organization in general. Then for the clockwork, so it was just, actually when I prepared this seminar, I was like, how can I provide, you know, a kind of example of a short scene that people can after watch maybe on YouTube and play with it on their own, thinking, you know, how do I feel after watching this? What kind of cues, like modes of knowledge are retaining my attention? It was just to have something that is really accessible. But it's quite funny because actually among the YouTube comments that I read, there was something speaking directly about management. And to me, it was really weird because I would have never thought about it. But it was something like, when all is said and done, you must commend Alex, the main violent character, on his unorthodox but effective managerial style. He's tough, but he's fair. Buying drinks afterwards show that he cares for his underlings. So actually, even in this, you could see a form of violent organization with its own rules. And it could, I mean, I'm not analyzing this movie or whatever, but I wouldn't be surprised that another researcher wants to see organizational practices there and question them. And then in terms of type of organization, I think, again, if you look at Emma Bell's book, for instance, the reading management and organization in film, you have a lot of examples of different professions, different, the gender representation in different professions as well, different work that had been researched by organizational scholars using different types of pop culture movies, actually. So I don't know if it answered the question at all, but.
Carine, there's a question from Mariana.
Mm-hmm.
How could the author's personal perspectives and biases potentially affect the resulting model? In your opinion, you're correct, as movies usually depict real-life context, but in my view, they can exaggerate the criteria you study, such as emotions. Personally, I believe this approach could be particularly advantageous in practical scenarios, such as during interviews or within the context of storytelling.
Yes, actually, it's a good idea. I think it's, I would love to see such a method stretched to something else. I mean, I think it's always interesting to have a kind of participatory thing and see, okay, how to make people react out of this. Yes, I think that the author personal perspective, I mean, introduce biases. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we were wrong with our interpretation. And I mean, if other researchers decide to undergo another, how to say, an analysis of the same movie and end up with different results, that would be super interesting to look at this. But for me, it's a richness, actually. What I think, but again, it's a matter of epistemology. So each one with their own. But for me, it's like whatever you do, you cannot be objective because you are a person with your own history, background, thoughts, emotions, etc. And for me, there's much more risk in trying to do as if you are not there, and give an interpretation that looks like totally objective and correct, rather than to admit, actually, we started this because of this, because our position was this, and maybe we have been influenced by that, and then you take this interpretation with knowing what could have also biased it, you know? Because to me, it's inescapable, simply.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Maybe it's more of a comment, Carine, but sometimes watching films, even for example, about criminals who are maybe the protagonist, but you kind of feel you're supporting that person, even though if you think perhaps more rationally, that's actually a criminal. You know, I wouldn't necessarily support that person in real life. So it's interesting how in films they can frame in the way that you begin to think differently about what's happening.
Yes.
I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience. There's one question from Jean-Pierre, which I think he was hoping to keep it for the last one. He's asking a rather personal question for the end, perhaps. After such an analytical experience with movies, can you, Carine, still enjoy watching them? Or has the experience changed what you watch?
What is true is that I drift very often, and my co-authors as well, towards semi-analysis when watching something. This is true. And but I still enjoy doing that because yes, it's a moment where normally, I try not to think too much, and yet, yes, but it's okay because it's enjoyable at another level where we are a bit more cynical into like receiving the audiovisual material somehow, or we have some reflex of okay, what happened there, it's kind of awkward. They want us to support this guy. For instance, you were talking about those anti-hero and whatever, and it's like, this is now getting weird that we are feeling sympathy towards a criminal. This is not okay, or whatever it is.